Hello, everyone, and welcome to the VezaTalks podcast. I'm your co-host, Stefan Katanik, and today I have with me my good friend, Erwin Voloder from the European Blockchain Association. Erwin, welcome to the VezaTalks podcast.
Hey Stefan, thanks for having me and very glad to be here.
Anytime, man. You know, we go back a long time,
Yes, sir.
very way back from Toronto, and here we are now in Belgrade, Serbia, recording a VezaTalks podcast. Why don't you give us a quick introduction to who you are, maybe how we know each other,
Sure.
and then from there we'll show the world what you're about.
Sure. So, I got my start in the blockchain space actually because this guy here roped me into it in about 2016, and we've been friends since about 2008, I'd say.
Yeah,
We've known each
around
other.
there.
Yeah. So in the startup scene, and then I started to focus a little bit more on regulation. I moved back to Europe. I started working for the European Commission as an economist, and then I lateraled over to the European Central Bank, where I was also an economist. And last November, I joined the European Blockchain Association as head of policy. And in a nutshell, I could say my job is coordinating on research and advocacy between the Web3 community and public institutions, obviously in the EU, but also increasingly internationally now in the MENA region, APAC, in the US, etc.
Amazing. You know, I've always had an interest in blockchain, as you know, but more importantly is like the crypto use cases
Sure.
around it, right? And I know you know it better than anyone that I know, right? And you're one of the smartest guys I know, and you're like the perfect person for this role, you know, and heading that policy stuff. So, you know, recently there's been a lot of talk around central bank digital currencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
From Canada, the United States, the European region, the Middle East, all of that. So what is it, you know? And there's a lot of questions and misconceptions around what really it is. Yes, it can be an easy form of payment. It can be an easy form of tracking. But what's the surveillance about it? You know, like there's obviously a aspect of surveillance and governments looking into how you're spending your money. Does this go into like, you know, them checking your credit score and it's completely tied to your credit score? Talk to us about that and like help us alleviate the air of some of the
Sure.
misconceptions.
So, I mean, to start with, I guess the term central bank digital currency, it's kind of like a taxonomy. So it's kind of like a grouping of different kinds of central bank digital currency. So you have things that are called direct CBDCs or central bank digital currencies, which are basically you have an account directly with the central bank. Then you have then you have indirect CBDCs, retail, right? Where there's an intermediary in between that would like open up the KYC and do the AML checks, and that's where you would actually have your account. And then it would be pre-funded, for example. Then you have what are called wholesale CBDCs, and wholesale CBDCs are not what you and I would use typically, like to pay for coffee or to buy sandwich or to pay for plane ticket. Wholesale CBDCs are more so for large value and volume transfers between like financial institutions and those kind of intermediaries, also for the purposes of cross-border payments and remittance settlement. And then you have what are called synthetic CBDCs, and synthetic CBDCs could be things like a commercial bank money token. So for example, if a commercial bank tokenized its deposits, that's a synthetic CBDC. Then you have things called trigger solutions. Trigger solutions in a European context would be like building a distributed ledger substrate on top of the European Central Bank's target to instant settlements, right? So it's like you take an existing central bank infrastructure that's on TradFi rails, and then you would build the DLT substrate on top of that. So when you say CBDC, it's really important to say exactly what kind of CBDC and for what purpose, because when you're paying for something or when there's value being exchanged, there's always the question of for who, to whom, how much, and why, right? So these things are really important to consider. In terms of the kind of the situation in the world right now, you have roughly around central banks representing, I think it's like 90% of global GDP that are either researching, piloting, or in a proof of concept, for example, with regards to either a retail or a wholesale CBDC. So these things are definitely coming, and some of them have already launched. The most prominent example of that is China's ECNY, or digital yuan, right? Then you also have the Central Bank of Nigeria, which has launched the eNaira. You have Project Sand Dollar in the Bahamas. The European Union is currently investigating the digital euro and will likely announce the implementation phase of the digital euro in October of this year.
So what are we looking at? Like when is it going to be an everyday thing?
That's a hard question to answer because in some countries it's already in the payment system.
Yeah.
India also has the digital rupee that they're testing on their unified payments network, right? Their UPI, which is super complicated and it's across the entire country. And it's really interesting to see how when you have this payment medium that's accepted by so many people, how you can just integrate a CBDC into that. I think that you also have to ask yourself which central bank in what region is doing it, why. So in the case of a retail CBDC, countries that have like weaker monetary policy and fiscal policy, so countries that don't really have a grasp over the way that they conduct their public finances, and let's say they have probably a more of a democratic deficit, they might choose to launch CBDCs for the purposes of financial inclusion because they also have a very large unbanked population. In advanced economies, like for example in the European Union or in the United States, a CBDC on the retail side would be or might be launched for the reasons of payments efficiency or financial efficiency. So to operationalize that last bit of value that can be sucked out.
Mm-hmm. How does this interact with, obviously there's a lot of financial crime involved with crypto, and there's a misconception of how money is moving, why certain people are paying with crypto as opposed to cash or bank transfers. How does CBDCs, how do they fight against that? Like, what are the risks we're looking at?
Well, a retail CBDC could give the government several instruments for the purposes of tracking financial transactions for anti-money laundering and know your customer reasons. You could directly tax consumers at the point of each point of sale transaction with the retail CBDC if it was designed that way. If a CBDC was programmable, then you could also attach political conditions to the spending. And what I mean by that is, let's say that you receive government welfare payments for being in a low income situation, and the government could tie the fact that you cannot spend those welfare checks on alcohol or on cigarettes, on things of this nature, that you have to spend it towards food, or if you have kids, to take care of your kids. The Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is like Singapore's central bank, has been testing something called Project Orchid. And Project Orchid is what they're defining as purpose-bound money. So by purpose-bound, I mean money that has conditions. The other side of the programmable coin, pun intended, is that programmability doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. If you can move past the political conditions, which we all agree are horrible, programmability at the level of like a smart contract, if a CBDC was built with smart contract functions, could allow it to do some pretty amazing things, especially for the future of the machine economy and IoT payments, digital twins, and things of this nature. So it's kind of difficult to say whether or not CBDCs will be an effective means of payment, because a lot of that is going to depend on whether or not people actually want to use them.
Yeah. And you know what, to tell you the truth, I'm very indifferent. A part of me saying, yeah, okay, it can be cool to use CBDCs and to buy everyday things, but at the same time, I think back at what happened in Canada with that trucker protest in Ottawa, how they basically froze everyone's accounts. Like, that can give the government so much control over how we spend our money and where we spend our money and who we give our money to, you know? And so I'm really in that fine line of like, okay, I'm a big believer in cash is king. It always has been. I believe it will continue to be king. On the other side now, it's like, okay, if they have that much control on how you spend your dollars, it could be, used politically because, you're out protesting against certain conditions that you have to adhere by because you live in that country, right? And that's the risk that I see. And I believe that change management going from like a cash society or like a Visa debit credit card society all the way to like using a central bank currency like the Canadian dollar or the USD that's backed on that. To me, it's like, we're already pretty much digital. The change will be an easy change to go over to that. But it's like the psychology of people to accept the fact that there's so much insights into how they're spending their money. I think that's going to be the biggest challenge.
Well, I mean, you have a few major hurdles to get over before you can get to this like so-called cashless society that keeps propping up and increasing in the literature as well, that I've been reading.
Yeah.
The first one is the digital divide.
Digital divide.
So what I mean by that is you have people existing today that are on completely different levels of the digital literacy spectrum. You have people that are, really young that can spin up a MetaMask wallet, that know how to buy and sell, they know how to self-custody their own crypto assets, they know how to go on Tor servers, they know how to scrape websites. Then you have people who don't even know how to turn on a computer and access an email or type in something into Google. So we have like polar opposites in our society, and yeah, you can make the argument that most people kind of sit somewhere in the middle, but in reality, to have a fully cashless society, 100% cashless society, that would have to predetermine that every single person was at least financially literate enough to use these means of payment
Yeah.
at the same level.
So it sounds like it'll first start off in these like tech hub cities where people are more inclined to actually use these digital services much faster than other places.
Well, it'll start off in places where people are more reared on technology.
Yeah.
Like what's interesting about Africa, for example, is that a lot of people in Africa across many different countries don't have bank accounts.
Yeah.
Yet almost everyone uses mobile banking apps.
Yeah.
Like from M-Pesa onwards, right?
Right.
So they're
And
they're
the thing
really
about them
weird.
is they skip the steps, whereas
Yeah.
like in the United States and Canada, we went bank accounts to having an online bank account to having a debit card to having a Visa debit card. So we actually went through all the intricacies of having a stable financial system that led to this, whereas in Nigeria and these places in Africa, they skipped steps because they actually didn't need to do that work in between because another nation did it and it worked for them, so they just went.
But a
ahead
lot of
and
the
skipped.
reasons they also skip steps is because they have governments that have serious democratic deficits, high levels of corruption, and a big reason why those people are also unbanked is because the government was not able to provide the basic services
Right.
to make people financially included.
Right. And that's why we're seeing now billions of dollars being dumped into Africa.
Yeah.
They're investing in all these different fintech companies, and it's growing so fast that, I foresee it by 2030, 2035, we're going to see Africa be a completely different place than what we know of it right now, right? Just by the amount of startups that are popping up there. Like I was reading this stat and it was really interesting to me because, you have all these VC firms that are created sub-brands to invest specifically into Africa. For example, Digital Currency Group, they have another company, Digital Currency Group Ventures or something like that, where they're just investing into African startups, all fintech companies, right?
Yep.
They're dumping money because they see what's happening there. They see that there's a lot of people there that are underbanked or unbanked at all. And then these new apps that are coming in, they're helping people out. And here's the thing. Everyone's got one of these. Mostly everyone, despite not having access to other services, most people have a SIM card and a cell phone, and I think that, we're going to see a big rise in Africa. So question for you, when it comes to these central bank currencies, who's the forerunner right now? Who's leading the charge?
Well, I mean, of the largest projects that have launched, it's definitely China.
Definitely China, right?
Yeah. So China's digital payments network, like
Well, I know on WeChat, you can do everything on WeChat.
the ECNY on one side, but then Alipay and WeChat Pay on the other side. And these things are like omni-channel apps, right? They're super apps. And people in China use this from everything from booking a dentist appointment to paying for their groceries. And everything is... So the digital yuan is fungible across and into these different applications. And then people also have separate PBOC, People's Bank of China, digital yuan wallets, right? What China's also doing now is it's increasingly starting to, bit by bit, inch by inch, internationalize the ECNY for trade finance, right? What I mean by that is to settle, for example, LNG trades, like with Total Energies recently, in digital yuan. They're experimenting the ways that they can use digital yuan or ECNY in the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Which is China's landmark piece of, call it industrial nation building. I mean, at this point, really, and how they can integrate the ECNY with their BRI partners, right? And then you have the European Union, the Digital Euro project. Sweden has the e-krona as well, because Sweden is not a euro area country for purposes of euro area cash, right? But it is an EU member state. You have countries in Africa. The Central Bank of Kazakhstan has launched one. An experimentation phase. The British government is looking into a digital pound. But really, in terms of what's available on the ground now and has a head start, it's China. And what China's also doing is it's trying to establish standards and interoperability standards around its CBDC, right? So they're lobbying heavy in the International Telecommunications Union for standards around these kind of things, right? They're participating in the G20. They're participating also within their own sphere of influence, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? The SCO, and I think that realistically, they'll probably be the farthest ahead once it's time to pull the trigger on using these things for trade finance. I wrote a chapter for a book recently, and I was talking about how you can use a digital euro for those exact same purposes. And our conversation about Africa made me think about that, because I said that I'm like, this is the battleground, really. And if the EU wants to take advantage of, because the EU has Global Gateway. Global Gateway is supposed to be like the democratic alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative, right? The Belt and Road Initiative is basically like it's debt conditioning finance, right? And it's debt trap financing, where China builds things for these countries. They take out massive loans on interest that they can't possibly repay, right? And then they fall into a debt trap. So what the EU is trying to do is the same thing, but in a more democratic way. Also promote democracy through this, and infrastructure and things of this nature. And I argued with my co-author that if you don't internationalize the digital euro for trade finance, I mean, you miss out on a huge opportunity to put the EU on a level footing. And also, if you go back to the 2018 communication by the European Central Bank on towards a greater international role for the euro, this is one way you achieve that. And you also maintain the EU's status as a reserve currency and things of this nature, right? So these are like really wide geopolitical topics that we're discussing here. And the thing with geopolitics is it moves slowly until it moves suddenly. Right? So things can kind of inch along for years and then finally snap.
Yeah, so now it's simmering right now.
It is, basically. It's like when you put a kettle, you put a kettle on the pot and it hasn't started to steep yet. That's what's happening. But I should say that nobody is dethroning the dollar anytime soon. All of this talk you hear about the de-dollarization and the emergence of competing currencies and the role of the ECNY and all of this stuff, you have to remember that if there are X amount of dollar-denominated liabilities floating around in the world, that means that there are X amount of dollar-denominated assets, because my liability has to be your asset and vice versa on balance sheet, right? Yeah. And you have to ask yourself, which are the countries that are holding this as an asset on their balance sheet? And realistically, China's biggest obstacle is that China does not have a liquid treasury market. Right? The United States can internationalize the dollar because they can internationalize the U.S. treasuries and a globally floating risk-free rate. China can't do that, right? And the problem is holding the ECNY is that you're holding the ECNY, right? It doesn't have the same full faith and confidence. That's why I think that all of this stuff is still happening at the margins. But going back to my other point, inch by inch, and then suddenly with a flood. So if we want to maintain a world that is, let's say, geared more towards democratic capitalism and not authoritarian capitalism, and if we buy the argument that certain things that the Chinese government is doing with its CBDC with respect to social credit is probably not the lives that we want to live, then we have to do something about it in terms of making sure that we also bring the tools to the table to compete on an equal footing, because we're not playing by the same rules.
So how do you now, like, for example, obviously social credit system in China is a huge thing, right? They built their economy on that. They manage all of their billions of people under that social credit system. There's talks of other countries doing it, and so these other countries that want to integrate some sort of social credit system that is based on visual identity. When a camera scans your face, they know all the details about you, right? Like in that movie, Born, I think it was Born? Yeah, in Born. They scan your face. He knows your credit score, how much money you have in the bank, what your criminal record is, if you're an alcoholic, gambler, where your next business trip is going to be, or your next trip is planned out, right? How far are we from that? Like, is there talks of that? And does that integrate with crypto and the whole social credit system? Because I fully see it as it's like a integrated system, vertically and horizontally integrated into like a digital identity. So you have your digital identity, digital passport, what do you want to call it? That's your access to the financial markets, to travel, to moving around, to buying real estate, selling real estate, everyday things, purchases, right? How far are we from that? Because, that has been a talk. And like you said, we're moving inch and inch towards that. And countries are now modeling after the Chinese system because they saw how China manages it, right? But, I'm sure the Americans, when they look at it, they're thinking, oh, we can create a much better system, right? That's not as contrary to certain people's beliefs when it comes to what that system actually means, like in George Orwell.
So, I mean, in the United States right now, you have certain state legislatures like Indiana and Florida, for example, which passed a ban on a retail CBDC within their state.
So you're saying with retail CBDCs, they can't actually go and buy like a meme coin or Bitcoin?
Well,
or to buy everyday
so
things?
this is the thing. Like, unless a CBDC is built with smart contract functionality, and unless a CBDC can be used as an on and off ramp into, for example, like a DeFi ecosystem, it's not going to be used for that.
Okay.
And to be honest with you, why should it be? I mean, I'm of the mind that as long as we have stable coins, and I also believe in algorithmic stable coins, although I don't think we have all the bugs worked out there quite yet. But I think that in the future, you're going to have, what I call digital currency areas. You're going to have stable coins, CBDCs, commercial bank money tokens, cryptocurrencies, and these things are going to float in some reluctant compromise with each other. And it's always going to be a clash of public-private money.
Yeah.
To your point on the social credit, you could make the argument that social credit could be in some way a lot of governments' dream scenario. But fortunately, we live in a society where to realize that at the level of what the Chinese state has done is going to face enormous pushback from the population. We, especially in the West, grew up on a culture of privilege and entitlement in terms of having the freedom to do what we want when we want within obviously the bounds of the law. But we don't like having our rights taken away from us. And a lot of people fight for their rights to this very day, right? For various things. So I think that when you talk about social credit, it's really important to remember that you're also talking about two different approaches to like the social political economy. And I don't think that that's easily transplanted into the West. On topic of digital identity, I can tell you that in Europe, at least in the EU, with the EIDAS framework, so that's like Europe's digital identity regulatory framework, which is now up for revision, issues related to privacy are a fundamental concern for the EU. They want citizens to have control over their digital identity. They want citizens to have control over their data. They support the use of what are called verifiable credentials under the W3C standards, right? Decentralized identifiers. And, they're gearing up to create an EU digital wallet where citizens can hold these public credentials. But ultimately, it depends on how much information you want to share with somebody and for what reason. So also experimenting with things like zero knowledge proofs, right? Keeping some of that data off chain, on chain, and making sure that those rights are protected. I think that privacy is fundamentally a Western concern. And in other places of the world, privacy doesn't really rank as important as payment sufficiency or inclusion. So again, it depends on like what starting point are you coming from as a society, and then you base and calibrate around that. I do fear though that it's an attractive system to be able to track everybody. And the way that you look at some people discussing smart cities, and the way that sensors are going to be used in smart cities and that kind of technology, I do fear that we run the risk of it being too tempting and then somebody at some point finding a way to do it. Because the one thing about China that you can say for sure is that Xi is going to be president for a long time. Unless there's some extenuating circumstance, he's not going anywhere. But we have governments that roll over continuously in the West. So what one government might not be for, another government might be for. And that's the drawback of our democratic process, is that, for now we might have politicians that say no social credit score. I can't tell you what's going to happen 15 years from now.
So Erwin, how do you stay sharp? Because obviously you deal with a lot of pressure, you deal with a lot of politicians, you deal with a lot of dirty hands, clean hands, all kinds of people, man. So what are some of the things that you do to stay sane in this ever-changing environment and all the things that are going through your environment on a day-to-day basis?
Well, for starters, I have a beautiful fiance who helps keep me sane. She takes care of all the things that I either don't have the time, energy, or effort to do after a busy day. So without her, I do not think that I would be able to continue on as I am. Physically speaking, I try to stay fit. I think that especially in my line of work, where I'm either caught between days that are full of meetings and then I have in-person meetings with politicians and with companies, and then I'm also doing a lot of reading. I sit for large periods of time. So to counteract the sitting, I run. I try to run every day or every other day. I try to do some calisthenics. I used to be really, really big into that. I've kind of dialed it down a little bit now, but I still try to maintain. And then honestly, just eat as healthy as you can and no more than 2 cups of coffee a day.
Nice. The 2 cups of coffee. I gotta try that. I'm still on my 5 to 6 a day.
Jeez.
It's been going pretty good. I can't complain.
5 to 6.
5 to 6. Look where we are. It's
Okay.
it's working for me. I use nicotine and caffeine as like my
Your stimmers.
my stimmers to help me get through the week, through the month, through the year, through the quarter, whatever you want to call it. So for me, it's I need that, and very similar to you. Like I need to stay sane in my head, and for me, I take pride in my relaxation and like just being alone and just thinking.
Sleep.
Sleep is super important.
I have to get my 8 hours.
Yeah, actually, last night I got a full 8 hour sleep. I woke up. I was still thinking I'm at the cottage up north.
Like a king.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Woke up
Yeah.
feeling refreshed, brand new,
Yeah.
ready to crush a week and ready to absolutely crush this podcast with you. And yeah, I think it's super important for us to stay fit, especially look, we're in our early 30s. We're young guns. We're up and coming. I think in order to compete in today's market with our competitors that we have, it's like, if you do one thing very good in your life, it's how you do everything else, right? And so to be a well-rounded man, you gotta, go to the gym. You gotta continue learning. You gotta have a good love life. You gotta have a good social life. Work is your outlet for all the creativity you get and all the relaxation and stimulants you get from outside of that, right? And so
I
it
think
all
we're also
applies.
fortunate to do something that we genuinely enjoy doing. I think a lot of
That
people,
too.
and I feel bad, but a lot of people wake up every day and they're forced to do a job that they hate.
Yeah.
I don't work a day in my life because honestly,
Exactly.
I really do love what I do, and I'll grind it out, man. 16, 17
Yeah.
hours a day if I have to. There's
Like
those
it's
moments,
nothing.
when it's crunch time, it's DEFCON 5, and you're in the trenches and you have to, because there's
Yeah.
deliverables that need to be met. But then you sit back after that and you're like, wow, like I really accomplished something here. And if you do enjoy what you do, if you're fortunate enough to find that, and I think that in this day and age, with all the tools that we have available, everybody is in a position, if they just carve out a little bit of time for it,
Yeah.
to hopefully transition into that thing that they really want
Yeah.
to do. And I hope that everybody does find it.
That's the thing. A lot of people are stuck in that repetitive loop of saying, "Oh, I gotta go to work. I gotta drive home. I gotta go to the gym. I want to start something new to get me out of this cycle, out of this matrix, and enter something else." But it's like, how do you find that time in the day that people have? And people struggle with that, right? And okay, they might find time today, tomorrow, but the day after, it's a consistency thing, right? Some people aren't consistent. Like I know you since I've known you since back in '08. You've been consistent at one thing. Whatever you apply your mind to, you go all in and you're consistent with it. Doesn't matter what it is. Everything that you touch, you're basically consistent with it. And I think a lot of people are missing that piece, because if it wasn't for consistency, let's be real, you and I wouldn't be on this podcast right now talking about central bank digital currencies.
No.
We wouldn't be here in Belgrade, Serbia at our studio here at Veza Digital that we created.
No.
If it wasn't for consistency.
Absolutely.
I think that is the secret ingredient to everything in
that
life.
And it's understanding that everything in life is about opportunity cost, and opportunity costs are easily summed up. It's just give up over get. It's the
Exactly.
fraction of give up over get.
Yeah.
What are you giving up and what are you getting for it?
Right. So do you apply that for everything, or opportunity costs?
I mean, life is governed by opportunity costs.
Right.
If I choose to get 1 hour less of sleep, if I'm giving up my 1 hour less of sleep that I know is valuable to me because I need my 8 hours to function, if I'm going to sleep 7 or if I'm going to sleep 6, there better be a reason why I'm doing that.
And how do you measure that?
That measurement is subjective to what you consider the value of the opportunity that you're giving up to get.
Okay, cool. So you're basically saying like, hey, I'm getting 7 hours of sleep instead of 8 hours of sleep, because that 1 extra hour, I'm going to go to the gym because I missed the day before.
Or if there's something that I need to finish because I know I don't have time to do it the next day, I'll get it done, because I'm a natural procrastinator if I don't keep myself in check.
Yeah.
And I know that works sometimes, when you're under pressure and then you have a chance, and sometimes you do brilliant work. But in my line of work, I can't do that because things pile up so fast, and I have to keep up with reading and all of my other policy initiatives and clients and this and that, and then still have time for a family life.
Yeah.
So I have to budget myself, which means that if I'm giving up something, there's got to be a reason why I'm doing it and what am I getting for it.
I feel that. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a member of my team, and he asked me, he's like, Stefan, how do you do what you do? Like, how do you actually do it? And to me, what I had to do a long time ago was take a step back, like a mental step back, and trust my team members to delegate certain tasks that have a clear instruction, a clear objective, what has to get done, and a deadline. And very early on, it was super hard for me to do that. I couldn't get myself to like give up complete control of that task at hand because I knew what was dependent on it and like the results we're trying to get. But once I just like took a step back and let go and let God, and I trusted my team to go and execute, it got done. But moving away from that, it's like, how do I get so much done? It's obviously being consistent in everything else outside of work, right? That applies to my work over here. And then, just properly managing my time. I used to be a really hard time manager, right?
But I remember.
I remember back in the day, man.
I remember you were Mr. Meeting Minutes, man.
Mr. Meeting Minutes, Yeah. And now today it's like I manage my time so like on a weekly basis. I have Mondays are strictly days for money in, business development, and doing things like this, networking, right? And then Tuesdays are like my days where I'm looking at inside the business, seeing what's going on. Wednesdays, Thursdays, that's on the business. Fridays is almost like a content day, free for all, talk to my team, see what's going on kind of thing. And for me, it's like, I know now that I have to, now we're in Q2, I know by Q3, I have different goals of me taking out 2 steps back, right? Yep. But in order to take 2 steps back, the team and I have to basically create some sort of infrastructure to go support that next level of growth. And for me, the consistency piece is always conscious, because like sometimes I feel lazy. I don't feel like doing it, but like I know if I don't do it, I'm just taking a loan against my own time.
It's a good way to put it.
And I got to like pay it back even more.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You're taking a loan against your own time. It's very true. I'll say for me that very similar, although I don't have a massive team that I'm working with in terms of doing the policy work. I do have a team and it's great. However, because a lot of what I do is politically client facing, like I mean, I can't call them clients, but politically facing, it requires also that political capital cost.
That political capital cost.
Yeah. So
talk to me about that.
So, I mean, the work that we do at these kind of associations, and there's other ones out there, obviously, and for different purposes, for different things. But on the lobbying side, it's always high stakes.
Yeah.
If there's a law or regulation that's currently making its way through the legislative process, and there are things in that regulation or that law that could be really detrimental to the future of the digital asset space, then we don't really have a choice but to raise those issues, because those issues carry an enormous economic and innovative cost, which is going to affect a lot of people. Because ultimately these rules, once they're binding in the EU, they're going to affect over 400 million people. So, and I had this from the other side when I worked in the public sector. So when I worked for the commission, like, when you're going over regulations and amendments and you're doing research, you're like, wow, like this is for the citizen is the end consumer here. I have to do this for the citizen. I have to think about Main Street. I can't just sit in my ivory tower. Like this has to be done in a way that the end user can get some sort of distributed benefit from it. And now I'm on the other side where I'm trying to keep those powers in check to make sure that process stays the way it is. So it's always this give and take. But that also carries a lot of pressure. And you need to learn when you work in my industry to manage and balance that pressure, because all the networking that you do.
Do you remember managing expectations?
I do remember. I use that in my daily conversation. I say that. I actually tell people that my job is managing expectations.
Yes,
because ultimately it is.
That's what
I have to manage expectations of the regulators. I have to manage expectations of the private sector.
Yeah.
And the goal is to get them to sit somewhere in the middle and speak to each other, using the same language. Because a lot of times they're not talking the same language, or they're talking over each other or under each other. And then you never get anything done.
Yeah.
So it is managing expectations, either through research or through public advocacy. And then, I speak at conferences around the world, and mostly about regulation, obviously, given the nature of my job. But I also love that I get a chance to express these issues and these topics to people. And I'm really excited when people come to me after and say, hey, I learned something new today.
Do you ever get pushback?
Sure.
For your ideas and stuff like that? How do you deal with that? Like, what kind of pushback do you get? How do you deal with it? Are there any negative notions out towards what you're doing at the European Blockchain Association?
Look, the pushback you're going to get from the public sector is going to be usually along whether or not something is like politically justifiable at that level. Institutions have obviously reasons why they do things and why they say things and why things are worded in the way that they're worded, right? And then it's your job to figure out whether or not that was just a mistake of interpretation, or whether that was a politically motivated statement and it was deliberate. And so I can't say honestly that at the level of the EU, I've had pushback in terms of what we publish, because we try to stay as objective as possible, and we try not to berate or patronize anyone. Like, the last thing I want to do is tell the government, you suck, you know, you don't know what you're doing, because you're never going to get anything done that way. Listen, there's a lot of really smart people that work in these institutions. I can tell you that for a fact. And there is also a lot of people that really want to get things done, but you have to understand, like, especially in the blockchain digital asset space, there's a huge knowledge gap. You know, this industry moves at a clip. And for example, like, within the span of 3-4 years, what we call DeFi is not what we call DeFi today.
Yeah.
What we call the crypto ecosystem in 2013, so far from what we call crypto today, it's not even funny, right? CBDCs were a thought experiment in 2015, right? Now, look at where they are. So this space, this industry, this technology moves at as close to the speed of light as you can get. And it's also hard for regulators to keep up with this, because there's a learning curve, just like it is for us in the private sector.
Right.
So, you know, that's always something you got to keep in mind.
Yeah. When it comes to pushback, what are some examples? What kind of pushback do you usually get?
I'd say some of the pushback I get is more so from the side of the community, more than from regulators. I think that there's two schools in the digital asset community. You know, you have the diehard maxis and you have pragmatists.
Diehard maxis, huh?
Yeah, well, the maxis, a lot of them share very orthodox libertarian views on the way that the political economy needs to be organized, on the way that the monetary system needs to be organized, and on the role of crypto and of digital assets and blockchain in that system. And then the pragmatists understand that there needs to be, you know, a give and take. There needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be a relationship. And at the end of the day, like, the nation state isn't going to disappear overnight. And like it or not, you're going to have to find ways to work within the rules and the system that you have, because you do not have a parallel society to just suddenly switch on and go to. And I think it's also managing expectations between those two schools. I'd say that's probably the hardest side of the job on the private sector. But look, if you present a good enough argument and you give everybody a chance to speak their voice, then I think that you can come to some sort of compromise most of the time.
Got you. Erwin, usually what we like to do at the end of the VezaTalks is I like to ask you a question. What's one question I didn't ask you that you would ask yourself?
Oof. One question. Where do I see the digital asset space? I don't know, in 50 years.
All right, where do you see it in 50 years?
I don't know. No, I'm kidding. Look, I think that in the future, like, the big bang moment is really going to come when you have blockchain, IoT, and artificial intelligence that can, like, seamlessly move together, kind of like braid together, and create the technical substrate for the future of the economy.
Interesting.
But I don't know exactly what that is going to look like. I just know that combination of technologies, and you can throw in quantum computing in there as well.
Yeah, to power all that.
Yeah, and post-silicon technology right at the hardware level. This is going to be likely the future of our monetary system and of our society. And I just hope that it's one where we're using these tools, right? Because technology is neutral. It's a tool. It depends on what you do with it. I just hope that we're using these tools for the greater good and not to our detriment.
And how do you feel about all that?
Currently, you know, when you flip a coin and it lands standing up, that's where I am right now.
Rough waters.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Erwin, it was a pleasure having you on the VezaTalks podcast.
Pleasure being here.
Always glad to have you. Always happy talking to you. I always learn. Whenever I talk to you, I feel like I get 1% smarter.
Well, thank you. You humble me, but you give me too much credit.